And so now I'd like to focus on a plot-specific and character-specific discussion of the film. And so once again, if you have not yet seen the film Shivers, I strongly recommend that you turn off this video right now and watch the film. And after you've done so, you can always come back to this video if you so choose, and at which time I would be very interested to hear your thoughts and comments about this 1975 work from David Cronenberg that is Shivers. But now, without further ado, let us focus on the specifics of this work, including the ending as well. And I think there is a lot to talk about. There is so much to talk about in that wonderful Cronenberg way, where he provides, Cronenberg and company do, where they provide, I think, a lot of room and landscape and place for discussion and debate with regard to many of the, I'd like to call the contradictions or inconsistencies, I think purposefully applied inconsistencies that are part of the very essence or makeup of the work that is Shivers. This is a film that is filled to the brim with a number of wonderfully, divinely created inconsistencies, the combination of which, or the various say, calculations with those various inconsistencies at the very heart of such calculations, I think lead to various avenues of entertainment, shock, horror, and indeed consideration and pondering and questioning of very universally accessible aspects of the human condition and relationships, and the way that one interacts with other people and indeed oneself. That is, say, in the form of communication, that is a form of sexuality, and yes, that is in the form of the way in which we perceive ourselves in the realm of existence. And so I think there is so much on display within this wonderfully almost subversive package of a horror shock film that is also in many ways mirroring and paralleling and echoing a lot of those deep-rooted themes of connectivity or lack of connectivity in respect of the human condition that we have already seen in past David Cronenberg works. I'm speaking specifically of Stereo and Crimes of the Future, and indeed which we will see in the future of David Cronenberg's brilliant and very thoughtful filmography going forward. But we also have it here, I think, inherently so and vividly so and quite fundamentally so in this, in many ways, groundbreaking work from '75, that is Shivers. So what do we have here? When I say we have, in my view, a number of beautifully set up inconsistencies, or maybe a better word would be contradictions, a wonderful set of combination of beautifully conceived contradictions, and I think make up this film and thus lead to further questioning or avenues of questioning. And so where can we begin with this? I think we can begin with perhaps one of the most concrete examples of this, which is the actual quote-unquote monster itself of the work. That is the parasite, which is, I think, in and of itself a very, very clever creation in terms of the various forms of interpretation that this parasite monster can engender. So what do I mean by this? So let's start with the maybe visceral fundamentals of this particular monster. The monster is, we understand from the various points of dialogue and scenes, exposition, of this film. For example, what Rollo says on the telephone to Dr. Roger St. Luke when he discovers some of the notes of Dr. Hobbs, after Dr. Hobbs has committed this murder-suicide with regard to this young woman, Annabelle, that opens the film in a very shocking way. And so we understand that Rollo and Dr. Hobbs, Rollo, the Joe Silver character, were somehow involved in a type of experiment or research that, or set of experiments involved in certain research that, from Rollo's point of view, seemed to have been based on the study of parasites and the way in which the symbiotic relationship between the parasite and the host, i.e. the human being, might somehow or another hopefully lead to some kind of benefit of the host. And the way that Rollo first explains it to Dr. Roger St. Luke when they're eating the pickle, is the idea of the parasite somehow taking over the functions of some kind of vital organ within the body, and in return, through some kind of symbiotic relationship with the human being host, somehow fulfilling the functionality of that otherwise missing organ or organs. That was the focus of what he perceived to be the train of research, as it were. But we understand that somehow later in the film, he discovers some notes of Dr. Hobbs, where Dr. Hobbs seems to be revealing a somewhat hidden agenda. And that hidden agenda makes itself known in terms of the idea expressed by Dr. Hobbs, or seemingly expressed by Dr. Hobbs in these discovered notes, that, as I say, Rollo says to the phone over to Roger St. Luke, as on the one hand we have Roger St. Luke sitting in his office in Starliner Towers while he is watching Nurse Forsyth, the Lynn Lowry character, undress and get ready for an evening of leisure and dinner on the one hand, and on the other hand we have Rolinski sitting in this office with the aquarium with sudden emergences of some kind of eel-like aquatic life form. But in any event, through this note revelation, we understand that the hidden agenda of Dr. Hobbs seems to have been the idea of his notion of humanity as being an overly rational creature, and thus to overcome this idea of over-rationalization, or perhaps to break down or destroy the sense of over-rationalization. This parasite was conceived, developed, and indeed mutated to invade the host and somehow break down these inhibitions, thus creating a sense of the infected host operating on an archic nature of unbridled and maybe unrestricted acts of fulfilling one's lust or desire. Thus the idea of the parasite being, as described in these notes, a combination of a very famous quote, combination of aphrodisiac and venereal disease. And so it's linked very directly with human sexuality, and I'll get to that momentarily. But here is the basis for the development and indeed the unleashing of the quote-unquote monster of the film, that is the parasite, which we understand therefore was somehow or another developed by Dr. Hobbs, and then the young woman Annabelle was apparently perhaps one of his first, if not his first first guinea pig of sorts. And so we understand, or the implication is that he infected this young woman, who in turn, through her various sexual liaisons with one or more people living in Starliner Towers. We understand there was an elderly gentleman who visited Roger St. Luke in his medical clinic somehow during the film, which is the implication that he had a sexual liaison with the young woman. Also, Nicholas Tudor, or as Dr. Roger St. Luke says, Tudor, the Alan Mijakovsky character, we understand that the implication is that he had or has a kind of sexual affair with the young woman, and thus we understand that through that he probably became infected with the bug. So already we have the notion that not only is this parasite somehow conceived on the basis of trying to break down the so-called over-rationalization of the human condition, but also we understand that the bug or parasite can be passed along through some kind of sexual activity or sexual intercourse, thus leading to other forms of infection or infestation of other people. Now, we should stop here and question exactly what the mode of infestation is. We see throughout the film the actual bug itself, which looks like a slug, a bloodied slug. Some people might interpret it to be like a moving or living bowel movement, or other people might interpret it to be like a very maybe a type of moving slug-like phallic creature of some sort. So whatever one's interpretation is, it's a pretty disgusting looking thing on first glance, on first sort of visceral impact. And there's blood trails, and the idea is there's kind of goo, and it's maybe related to feces or that sort of thing. So it has this maybe visceral impact of being very disgusting. And I think that's part of the great effect of the film in terms of the way it appears, the monster of the film. But we see throughout some aspects, we see how the parasite is transmitted from one host to the other. Either the parasite itself acts on its own, it attacks, for instance, the woman in terms of the washing machines, the coin laundry area, and it just flies and attacks her, and it seems to infect that particular woman that way. We also see how the bug or the parasite seems to be able to fly. It also has maybe some aspect of burning or some kind of acidic secretion power or aspect, which is revealed when it attacks Rollo towards one of the climactic scenes at the end involving the body of Nicholas Tudor and the slugs, and they suddenly attack him from his torso, etc., and they attack his face in a very gory scene. There's also the way in which they seem to be transmitted via kiss. And so we remember there's a very famous or infamous scene where the act of infection occurs between the character of Betts, the Barbara Steele character, and the Susan Petrie character, Janine Tudor, as they share a kiss. And then we see the bulging of the neck of the Barbara Steele character move, and then suddenly we understand that the bulging of the neck of the Susan Petrie character, the Janine character, is meant to suggest that the bug has passed from one person to the other. And also we understand that there can be more than one bug or infecting parasites infecting a particular host. And so there is this idea of maybe reproduction of some sort that isn't really gone into so much detail in terms of the actual mechanics and the evolution and the biology of this particular parasite in the film, but we understand that there is some idea of reproduction, there is some way in which it seems to be acting on its own. However, we don't necessarily get a sense of how it might pass from one person to the other through other means, and so we're not sure if for instance, if it's something that can maybe pass from one person or another through the act of maybe sexual intercourse, through the act of the physical interaction of sexual organs of one human being with another human being. And so this idea, which is connected to venereal disease, is something that I think is left very much in the open. Exactly, is it something that is actually connected with venereal disease, or is it something that is purely passed through its own self-volition, that is the volition of the parasite, or is it something that is passed through, say, mouth or other types of entryway that is not directly related to the sexual organ of the human body? And so these, I think, are questions that are not, obviously they're not dealt with because you don't see any direct scenes of this sort of transmission per se, but the implication is there by virtue of the fact that we understand that Annabelle, the young woman at the very start, she is described later on as being sexually promiscuous, having a number of sexual partners, and also we understand that, as I say, going back to the very famous quote as relayed to us and to Roger St. Luke by Rollo over the phone, the idea is that this is a combination of aphrodisiac and venereal disease. So in that, I think, very implicit way, there's the idea of sex or sexual-based transmission, but we also understand that the monster is also operating on a number of other modes or methods of transmission that also give it the sense of the monster-like aspect, the attacking monster, some kind of threat externally that attacks using acidic secretion, etc., flying and almost having a will of its own. There's moments where Nicholas Tudor is talking to the monsters. It's almost like there is a type of maybe act of controlling the will of the host, as it were. So there's a sense of not just infecting or infestation, but also possession, as it were. So those, I think, are hallmarks of a type of quote-unquote traditional monster movie type of monster trait, that is the external evil force taking over one's will against one's will. So I think that's one aspect of it. But on the other hand, it is also suggestive of something that is very much, say, natural, that is something that is very inherent to nature and indeed human nature. It might seem to be somewhat, maybe in certain circles, somewhat unpleasant or maybe distasteful, but it's still, in other circles, still very rational and very relevant to human biology and indeed human sexuality and thus to human existence. And so what I'm referring to here is the monster, the parasite, is linked to human sexuality. It's also, I think, by virtue of the fact that it has this bowel movement slash phallic imagery associated with it. It is also, I think, in those ways still very much akin to human nature. After all, the idea of human waste is also, it might seem unpleasant in the eyes of certain perspectives, that's for sure, but it's still undeniably a factor of human growth and human development, and the idea of digestion leading to waste and fecal matter. And so that is part of the cycle, say, of daily living. And also, as I say, the phallic symbol imagery of the monster is also inherent to the way in which it seems to be linked to a sort of fundamental aspect of human sexuality. And so there is all this, I think, at play. And so those, I think, are very subtle means or nuanced means by which we are getting not just a quote-unquote existential evil threat in the form of this parasite monster, but we are also getting what could arguably be said to be something that is perhaps more closely linked to human nature and human development and biology than one might be comfortable with. And I think when one realizes the closeness of those associations, I think it becomes even more of a frightening aspect indeed, thus leading to this idea of the monster, in my eyes anyway, being a representation of what one might call a contradiction of the film, a purposefully conceived contradiction of the film. Namely, the monster is an external evil threat, but also is something that seems to be representative or emblematic or otherwise linked to aspects that are very wholly linked to fundamental aspects of human nature. So I think that's one area of the contradiction. Another area of the contradiction, which is also related to the parasite in my view, is just what its output or what its results are in terms of what happens when it infects or the possibility of infection takes place. So after all, we understand that the conceit of this monster is based on the idea that through its infecting, it somehow seems to be letting loose the passions and the uncontrollable urges of the people that are infected, thus leading to these attacks, these violent, vicious attacks from infected to the non-infected. And that cycle then leads to more spread of the quote-unquote disease, and the more chaos that spreads, the more anarchy that seems to exist, leading to the almost the orgiastic conclusion that leads to the ultimate quote-unquote downfall of Roger St. Luke in the swimming pool in the hands of the Lynn Lowerly Nurse Forsyth character, in one of the most, I think, chilling ways that a Cronenberg film could end, by the way. But here we have, I think, another inherently built-in contradiction related to the parasite itself, namely the idea of what is the concept or what is the harm that seems to be caused when we are dealing with this type of result that's taking place upon infection. So what do I mean by this? I think taking a step back, trying to describe this point, I can maybe bring one's attention to an observation, which is that it seems to me that, yes, of course, there are quite shocking moments where infected people do carry out these acts that seem to be very absurd, very violent, very dangerous, and very shocking indeed, in terms of the way in which sexuality is expressed among the infected towards those who are non-infected, and the idea of a real physical type of imposition that can be very threatening and indeed very violent indeed. So this is undeniable, and that, I think, leads to part of the quote-unquote horror aspect of the film. But also, there are moments in the film where it can be said that the old order, which is the current state of things, versus the new order, which can be said to be the state of the infected or the post-infected state. I think it can be said that even with respect to the so-called old order of things, that is the current state of things, one can see, or one can identify, at least as shown in this film, one can identify very obvious cracks of, say, morality, and also not just cracks of morality, but real dangerous fissures of morality that lead to a type of morass, if you will, a type of immorality or a type of dangerous immorality that exists in the world current order prior to the infections taking place. For example, we see when we hear about the past of Dr. Hobbs from Rollo, when he's explaining it to Roger St. Luc about how he had what apparently was a type of sexual liaison with the young woman, Annabelle, at the time. And she was just a young girl. She was 12, I think, was Rollo's description of it. So this is a very shocking story that is being told by Rollo Linsky. And there apparently seems to have been no serious recriminations made against Dr. Hobbs. I mean, to the point where he was still apparently able to get money for grants because he says, he had a talent for getting grants, and is also apparently able to continue his research, including his relationship with this young woman. And so that, I think, is showing a very dark aspect of, as I say, the current order. There is no infecting at the time, at least as far as I understand it. And so that type of darkness and that type of immorality is existing prior to the events of Shivers and the events of the infected parasite chaotic activity to take place. So that, I think, can be indicative of some kind of decay in the so-called old order of things, where we have then arguably the displacement of a new order, that is the order of the parasitic chaotic aspect, what seems to be swallowing what is the decaying moral decay of the old order. Another aspect of the moral decay of the old order could be this, which is while there are arguably, or while there are not arguably, but most definitely aspects of the frightening and scary in terms of those who are infected, one has to remember too that when we first see acts of violence against people who are in this film, we see it in terms of acts of violence carried out by people who we understand are not infected. And these non-infected people are carrying out these actually quite horrific acts of violence against those who are infected. For example, Dr. Roger St. Luc, when he is in the basement of the Starliner Towers trying to find what he ends up finding, which is one of the slugs, and then he's attacked, and so he again has to defend himself. But the way he defends himself is he attacks his attacker quite viciously, to the point where perhaps he has seriously injured or indeed killed his particular attacker. So that is an act of violence that Roger St. Luc has committed. Another act that he himself has committed is when the guard is attacking, assaulting the Lynn Lara character, Nurse Forsyth, in the car, in the parking garage. Roger St. Luc, he doesn't grab the body, or he doesn't grab the security guard, but instead he goes for his gun in the holster, which was featured at the very opening of the film with the Swedens, or as the Ron Modzik character calls them, the Swedens. But in any event, Roger St. Luc takes the gun from the holster during this climactic scene, and he shoots him in the back. And so here we have an act of killing on the part of Roger St. Luc. And so here we have the violent acts that are compounded by even further violent acts. And indeed, those further compounding violent acts are being committed by the non-infected, that is Roger St. Luc. And indeed, also, if we go back to the very beginning of the film, we're not sure exactly what the state of infection is with regard to Dr. Hobbs, but the implication is that Dr. Hobbs was not infected, whereas Annabelle was infected. And so if that's the case, which I think is a reasonable interpretation, then what we can assume from that opening scene, which is a very shocking scene where we see Dr. Hobbs essentially strangle and kill and mutilate the body of this young woman before, or whereas before taking his own life in a very violent way. He who is, we assume, or the assumption can be that he is non-infected. He who is non-infected is carrying out this very vicious act of violence against someone who is infected. And so then the question is, who are the aggressors in this particular dynamic here? Are the aggressors really those who are infected? Or are the aggressors, in fact, those who are non-infected? And so what does that mean in terms of the old order versus the new order? Is really the new order of the parasitic chaos and anarchy really anarchic? Or is it indeed swallowing up something that already had some kind of aspect or fissure or indication of some kind of moral decay? And so I think the interpretation of that particular situation can fall on many different avenues or many different planes, depending on where you as a viewer fall. And I'm not saying that there's one interpretation that overrides the other. All I'm saying is that I think there's room for many forms of interpretation in terms of this dynamic. Who are the villains of this piece? That's, I think, another way of putting it. And so, at least what I want to suggest here is I think there's room for that type of discussion. Now, again, one can further extrapolate from these particular events and say, for instance, maybe Roger St. Luke was maybe acting in a type of self-defense type of way, and that sort of thing. And that goes into the sort of legal implications of self-defense and the like. And so that, I think, adds, I think, an extra dynamic of intrigue and also fascination with these particular situations. But the point that I wanted to bring up here is that I think it's quite a morally complex framework that we are dealing with in the world of Shivers. And so it's so morally complex that I think it's not clear cut as to who is the quote unquote hero and who is the quote unquote villain. And indeed, it's so morally complex and nuanced and a gray area such that I think we could, the interpretation is certainly plausible that one can see the infected as being the victims in terms of this particular, say, moral play that is playing itself out in the hands of David Cronenberg and company in the work Shivers. And so this is another form of what I would call the contradiction that is beautifully constructed vis-a-vis the monster or the parasite and how the parasite interacts with the society of Starliner Towers and the characters specifically that we meet along the way. And yet another aspect I think that's very important in terms of the contradictions that I think are inherent and built into this work in a fundamentally brilliant way, I think it has to do with the way in which maybe couples and unions and relationships are portrayed in this film in various forms, in various, say, stages. So maybe just taking a step back, I think one of the great things about this film Shivers is how it sets up the network of characters that we see. And there are arguably a lot of characters that we meet here. So we have the Tudors, we have Roger St. Luke and Nurse Forsyth, and we have an elderly couple that we see wandering the halls or wandering the entrance of the building at the outset, and later the elderly woman gets attacked. And then that leads to further attacks, that leads to the ultimate showdown in the pool, etc. And there are other couple dynamics along the way as well, the Doctor and Annabelle and the like, and Betts and Janine, etc. So I think this is these couple dynamics, and also the Sweebens, etc. And I think this couple dynamic is very important because each couple, I think, is somehow or other a representation of a certain stage of, say, relationship development. Sometimes we have couples that seem to be very much in love and enjoy each other's company. I think the Sweebens or the elderly couple seem to be very much together and enjoying each other's company very much. And yet we have other couples that seem to not enjoy each other's company for one reason or another. The Tudors, I think, come to mind in particular, the Alan Mijakovsky character, Susan Petrie character, while she seems to be wanting to maybe continue or to repair that relationship, he seems to not want anything to do with the relationship, but he seems at the start of the film to already be infected by the parasite, and that might be somehow clouding his own thinking. But in any event, that is a relationship that is very much on the rocks for whatever reason, either emotionally, intellectually, or physically, or perhaps due quite directly in terms of the parasitic invasion or the infestation or the infection, at least as far as one of the persons of that relationship is concerned, in the tutor relationship or the two-door relationship. Also, a similar type of dynamic is happening in the relationship between the doctor and the nurse. There's, we assume, a type of intimate or romantic relationship that exists or had existed in vis-a-vis those two characters, but we also understand that maybe he is perhaps not as into her as much as she might be into him. And there are little hints or clues which suggest that maybe he is a little bit cooler towards the relationship than she is. And so that is another indication of a type of division or divide between two human beings that is, interestingly enough, remedied by the introduction of the parasite. In other words, the parasite in a lot of these situations where we have divides seems to serve in an interesting, almost ironic way to either remedy or patch up certain relationships, or to create new ones, or to find new ones where they're otherwise not existent in the so-called old order. Now, whether those new relationships are indeed ethically or morally sound, I think that leads to another realm of discussion or question. So I'm not saying that necessarily all these human connections are automatically good or automatically bad, but what I am saying is that they do exist on a biological level and indeed on an emotional level, and then query whether, in a separate realm of discussion, those new unions or those new connections are, say, morally or ethically sound. I mean, there is a particular, I think, disturbing scene involving what we understand to be an older man with a younger woman. That is a very quick shot in one of the rooms of the Starliner Tower at the very end, in terms of when all chaos breaks loose. And so the implication, I think, is a very disturbing one indeed. But there are other instances where a type of union or a type of association or connection between two human beings having to do with the infection of the parasite in one form or another, I think leads to this type of connection, which seems to be otherwise repairing a somehow damaged relationship that existed prior to the infection. So what do I mean by this? So for example, let's take the example of the Tudors. Now, perhaps Nicholas Tudor, the Alan Mijikovsky character, might be seen to be somewhat of an exception, because he is a very, maybe, he seems to be a very unpleasant character in terms of how he treats Susan Petrie character, how he seems to be maybe just in it for himself. He seems to be very unpleasant. There's a sense of a type of coldness or rudeness as well to his particular, say, character development. But I think that's part of the way in which his particular, say, place in the context of this network of characters, I think, serves a really interesting and intriguing purpose, because what that means that the Susan Petrie character is somehow or another gravitated towards the Barbara Steele character, Bet's character. And so what we have is we have the union or the connection between the Barbara Steele character and the Susan Petrie character in a very haunting scene, and also a very, I think, a very poignant scene in terms of the way in which these characters, we have seen in past scenes throughout the film, they have a friendship. They enjoy each other's company. One goes to the other for advice, for like relationship advice, etc., and the other gives that type of advice. But there's also a type of attraction that seems to exist. Perhaps it is a unilateral attraction, or perhaps it is indeed a mutual attraction. And in fact, the parasite can be said to be not just an engendering of this mutual attraction between these two characters, but perhaps is a type of emollient of some kind of feeling or attraction that was already there to begin with, but it was just somehow inhibited by, say, certain feelings of loyalty to relationships or to other people, or maybe certain feelings of maybe some kind of social mores having to do with sexuality and heterosexuality versus homosexuality, etc., etc. Whatever the case may be, it could be said that the introduction of the parasite, as violent and as shocking as it is, could also lead to this connection between these two human beings. Case in point, note exactly when the Susan Petrie character the Janine Tudor character, when she becomes responsive to Betts's appeal to make love and to kiss. And indeed, right, they kiss each other. But the point that she seems to be responsive to the kiss is not after she's been infected, but just prior to her being infected, right? They kiss and she doesn't show any signs of struggle beforehand. Then, of course, immediately after, we see the bulging of the necks, which is to suggest that she has now been infected. And indeed, after that, the embrace, excuse me, becomes more passionate. That's certainly the case. But the point in which she seems to be at least open to or openly responsive to the kiss actually occurs prior to her infection. Betts has already been infected, that's for sure, but not Janine. And so I think this is a real key point, because what it suggests is that maybe her feelings towards this particular person, the Barbara Steele character, were already there to begin with. And it was just a matter of breaking down these inhibitions. There's a real emotional sort of hysteric state involving Nicholas just prior to that. So that probably led to a type of emotional sensitivity that she found herself in, her state of mind, as it were. And the parasite just provided a further catalyzing act or momentum. But needless to say, I think there is room for the idea that the parasite is, in fact, just furthering along feelings that were already there. And if that's the case, I think there is something to be said in terms of the possible positive nature of the results of these particular parasites. Not in all cases, that's for sure, but at least in certain cases. Another case in point in terms of the quote-unquote possible positive nature of the outcomes of the parasite infestation is the relationship between Lynn Lowry's Nurse Forsyth and also Paul Hampton's Dr. Roger St. Luke. So this is the relationship, as I say, where he seems to be not so into her as much as she is into him. But that leads to a type of maybe distance between the two. There is still a maybe intimacy between them, but arguably speaking too, there is also maybe a distancing, at least from his side, not from her, because she seems to really want to be with him. But this distancing, whatever the case may be, whatever the reasons are for this, is certainly closed. The gap is closed by the very end, even at the point where, at the very last gasp prior to that kiss in the pool, he is resisting. He is resisting to the very end until he succumbs, because the entire group is essentially in this sort of orgiastic filled climax. Seems to overcome him. And so the frightening aspect of this is that his will is being overcome. And so that is, I think, a very nuanced way to view it. And that's the horror film genre climactic ending way to see this. That is, he has lost. Roger St. Luke has lost. The struggle of the individual against the group is one where the individual has lost. And so that's one way to look at it. And that is a very frightening and chilling way to view that particular end scene. However, I do want to suggest that it is also possible to view that scene as a happy ending. It is a happy ending perhaps because we see the union of these two characters that have otherwise, through some rigmarole of character development maybe that we're not privy to as viewers, but through some reason or another, there's a type of standoffishness, especially on his part. And so, arguably speaking anyway, and so that gap has closed. And if that gap is closed, there is, I think, a room for, I think, celebration, especially with these two characters who, up to a certain point, we have rooted for. They are very likable characters. And so Lynn Lowry's Nurse Forsyth and also Paul Hampton's Dr. Roger St. Luke, I think they are the heroes of the film. And so we want them to succeed, I think, from a certain point of view. And in fact, their union, their romantic coupling, I think is, through one interpretation of the film, a happy ending. And so if that's the case, then indeed the happy ending has occurred because of the infestation of the parasite that has taken place. And you just, that wonderful detail at the very end when they're all driving out and the credits roll, you see doctor and nurse and they're driving, but they're all dressed up in this almost swanky, very interesting 70s almost disco outfit type of style. And so they seem to be ready for a real night on the town. I mean, a real night on the town, whatever that's going to ensue, and the chaos and anarchy that will unfurl upon the neighborhoods of Montreal. But in any event, there is a sense of the freedom or liberation, and the idea of type of sexual liberation that leads to an almost emotional liberation, and I think that's a really important point as well. Also, I think, which is supportive of the idea or the interpretation that this is indeed a happy ending, is that their relationship or the infestation of the parasite is not 100% wholeheartedly chaos or anarchy. There is an almost calculated way in which the parasite is operating to the point where it is not causing just random acts of violence or chaos, but it's causing people to break down their inhibitions. Case in point, the very end, when they're driving off, it's a very orderly thing, and the two of them are driving, and they're coupled, and they're paired, and so that has a sense of order about it. And so there is no sort of chaotic, almost zombie-like random act of violence that is occurring at the very end, leading to the end credits. No, it's very orderly-like. And so there is this idea, therefore, of the calculated breakdown of inhibitions. Also, note the relationship, the symbiotic relationship between, especially between Nicholas Tudor and the parasite, and he's talking to them as though there is a type of consciousness that is involved with the parasite. And if there's an act of consciousness, perhaps there's this idea of will on the part of the parasite and also on the part of the host. Also, there's a very key scene involving the Ronald Motzig character, Merrick, when he seems to be trying to deal with certain residents who are complaining towards the end of the film about these chaotic acts. And he very calmly directs them to a room. And when he brings them to the room, he closes the door and we see other infected people. And then he reveals himself to be infected and they essentially attack them. But before that, he had a very calm demeanor. And so he was able to control himself, even though we understand that he was infected, or the assumption is that he was infected. Therefore, the idea is that infection doesn't always lead to automatic chaos or anarchy. There's a type of control in terms of a balance of wills. Perhaps this is a parallel of the idea of the parasite equaling a type of symbiotic relationship between parasite and host. It's not a full-throated type of possession, but there is a sense of a symbiotic relationship between two entities that have a will that is somehow singularly combined into one ecosystem or nervous system of the human body, whatever the case may be. But in any event, it is not necessarily the idea of infection leading to chaos. There is something perhaps also very coolly calculated, and that cool calculation could lead to the breakdown of inhibitions, leading to the connection between two human beings, two individuals. Now, that is arguably a happy ending. Now, I just want to emphasize too that it is not necessarily the case that it's a kind of black and white issue, that we have pure moral ambiguities cleaned up in favor of a type of heroic virtue dynamic overcoming the evil of the world. On the contrary, everything is still very morally befuddled and confused, because, as I say, where we have connections, question whether those connections are indeed always positive or beneficial. But perhaps those connections can too lead to destructive qualities. The idea of the breakdown of the human will of one partner, the subservience of one partner in favor of the dominance of another partner, the idea of subservience versus dominance. What happens to that subject that is the subject of the dominance? Will that subject become destroyed in terms of the over-domination of the dominance? This leads to this idea of power play that we saw at the very outset of Cronenberg's filmography back in Stereo. And so this is the kind of threat, as it were, and that threat can be physical and that can be emotional. And indeed, in terms of the old order and the laws that are in place, we have certain rules of society that prohibit or restrict these sorts of relationships of a certain kind, either due to differences in physical age in terms of, say, expressions of manifestations of will or intent or lack thereof, etc., etc. And so we have these laws set up. Now, one of the frightening things, and going back to the idea of the old order being replaced or swallowed up by the new order, the current state of things versus the infected state of things, it can be a frightening, liberating, and also very beautiful, but also very shocking thing to have the old order become destroyed in favor of the new order. This is also leading to a type of inherent socio-political dynamic of the film, which I think is also very much part of Cronenberg's say, cinematic politics, for lack of a better phrase. That is the idea of revolution. That is the idea of the death of one society in favor of the takeover of another society or another societal dynamic. And here we have that on display in terms of the infection, the infestation. This is the new order, and it is taking over the old order. And that takeover can be very liberating. It can also be very frightening and very, very chilling indeed, because of the implications that will be instilled in terms of the establishment of so-called new relationship dynamics. And queer whether all of those new relationship dynamics seem to be actually healthy and beneficial, or are some of them, or indeed all of them, very unhealthy and indeed very dark and cryptic indeed. So this, I think, is very inherent in the idea of revolution or takeover that is also at the heart of Shivers. And so it becomes almost in this very perverse and wonderfully a horror shock packaged way a film that is also about class distinctions being eroded or destroyed in favor of a type of new world order that is expressed in the context of this isolated community of the Starliner Towers, but then they break free at the very end, leading to what kinds of chaos, who knows, what is left to the imagination of the mind's eye as the film ends, as the credits roll. But that's also, I think, very important as well. And also, speaking of the idea of change, and the idea of transformation and evolution, not only do you have the socio-political economic implications of the takeover of the new order vis-a-vis the old order, but this idea of change or transformation, which is also the idea of revolution, is inherent in a concept or discussion of evolution and human evolution and transcendental type steps towards a different, say, progress of evolution or existence. Or existence, perhaps. The idea here being that the parasite, when it infests or infects a human host, it changes the host into something that that person was not prior to the act of being infected. And so that person is changed. Now, we never see in the film any discussion of a cure. We never see any idea of an infected person becoming cured or no longer becoming infected. And so the implication, at least within the confines of the running time of the film, are that once one is infected, perhaps there is no way of turning back. That person will be forever infected. Thus, the idea is change and the idea of evolution. And the idea that this is maybe in many ways a type of permanent change. If this is a permanent change, then this is maybe it's either a progressive or regressive step in the flow of human evolution and transformation. And that transformation is from a state of being that seems to have certain inhibitions that seem to be imposed via the external society, what we call societal mores or mores or rules, that prevent someone from otherwise acting out his or her carnal or primal urges. But those boundaries are destroyed once the parasite takes effect. And so once those boundaries are destroyed, then the inhibitions are gone, and so the walls are broken. And so the person is thus forever changed. Thus, this is a film that is about evolution or transformation in a very, very major way. And this is also a very strong Cronenbergian concept. We have seen the idea of evolution or change or transformation in the discussion of stereo, in discussion of crimes of the future. We will see it again in other films like Rabid, Scanners, Videodrome, The Dead Zone. We'll see it in Existence. We'll see it in Dead Ringers, The Fly, many, many examples. Naked Lunch, M. Butterfly. We'll see it in so many examples. And so it is still here, so current and so much part of the primary, say, momentum of this work, Shivers. That is the change, the fundamental change. And what is that change focusing in on? I do want to emphasize this as well, and this will bring the conversation full circle, I hope, which is the concept of the way in which people are connecting with each other, how people relate to each other, how people try to approach each other. The idea of Starliner Towers, I think, is very apropos here. The concept of Starliner Towers being on Nuns Island, segregated from the rest of Montreal, it's its own little self-serving, self-contained little community with its own, say, restaurants or own medical clinic and shopping areas, etc. So it can basically, it's a self-serving community. It can feed itself, as it were. But there is a type of maybe limitation to isolation. And I think that image of the isolated Starliner Towers is in stark contrast to the results and the conclusions and the type of resulting behavior that the infected parasite or the infected person who is infected by the parasite can cause. In other words, the urge is to break free from such state of isolation and thus make connections with other people. That's, I think, the essence of what the parasite does. Again, going back to how Rollo described Dr. Hobbes's notes, the idea of the over-rationalization of human beings and the idea of the introduction of the aphrodisiac / venereal disease in order to break down these walls that divide human beings because of the quote-unquote over-rationalization. Well, that over-rationalization can also be manifest externally in terms of architecture, buildings, walls, Starliner Towers. And so what do we see at the very end? The very walls seem to be, metaphorically speaking, broken down when the line of cars leave the garage space and out into the very public, the very open at the very end, leading to what we assume to be more chaos. But this is the idea of human connections. They are out to try to make connections. And so what is another way to talk about connections? Human connections, the way to express that is also through communication. It's also through sexuality. And so the concept, I think, inherent in the bug or parasite is the idea of making or creating the sense of the manifestation of the urge that is internal, but that urge is manifest externally in order to somehow fulfill a sexual urge or desire. Now, whether that's morally right or morally wrong, that is, I think, a related yet still separate line of discussion. But regardless of that, or depending on the circumstances or situation, those results might change. But alongside that, I think undeniably we have this idea of the sexual urge on display and unbridled and unlimited and unrestricted. So this is, I think, a very key aspect to the notion of the change of human evolution into a type of sexual being. And if that's the case, that I think that also has a very transformative aspect, because the idea of sex is in many ways the idea of reaching out, the idea of expressing something from within, some kind of feeling or urge or desire. And that expression can be maybe something to do with how one feels about someone else or something else, or how one physically interacts with someone else or something else. And so this is the idea, therefore, of not isolation, but in fact union or joining or communion or communicating. Yes, human sexuality made manifest in the idea of the slug-like creature or bug or parasite that is at the center of Shivers. And this is one of the key aspects of this film, and thus, I would say, in David Cronenberg's work writ large, the idea of the expression of sexuality, the role of sexuality in not just the social economic dynamics of the old order being consumed by the new order, but also in terms of the state of human evolution, transformation. I don't think it's a coincidence where we have arguably a reading of this film about the change of humanity, the evolutionary steps, the transformation of human existence being linked to or otherwise furthered on or promoted or propelled forward by the idea of the bug, which is essentially a sex aphrodisiac. And so we have the notion of transformation linked to sex, evolution linked to sex. And if we have transformation, evolution linked to sex, then indeed I think the extension of that reading is the idea of existence equaling sex. And if we lead to that particular conclusion, I think we come to what is one of the key dialogues in any Cronenberg film, which is the speech from Nurse Forsyth to Roger St. Luke after they have evaded certain attacks. But we understand at this point, Dr. St. Luke doesn't know it yet, but she, Nurse Forsyth, the Lynn Lowry character, has already been infected. And so they are together alone in the basement of the building, and she gives the famous speech. So this is the speech, which is, "Roger, I had a very disturbing dream last night. In this dream, I found myself making love to a strange man. Only I'm having trouble, you see, because he's old and dying, and he smells bad, and I find him repulsive. But then he tells me that everything is erotic, that everything is sexual. You know what I mean? He tells me that even old flesh is erotic flesh, that disease is the love of two kinds of creatures for each other, and even dying is an act of eroticism, that talking is sexual, that breathing is sexual, that even to physically exist is sexual. And I believe him, and we make love beautifully." And so what does that speech say? The nurse, Lynn Lowry's Nurse Forsyth speech say that everything is sexual, that breathing is sexual, that communicating is sexual, that to even exist is sexual, and that making love is a beautiful thing, and because it's somehow or another fulfilling the destiny of human evolution or transformation, at least in the hands of David Cronenberg. This is, I think, a really profound, disturbing, and fascinating concept, the idea of evolution and existence. Human existence is sexual. Just to exist is sexual. And what that, I think, conjures up in one's mind is the idea that, indeed, if we can recognize or remind ourselves that human sexuality is, in essence, an aspect of human nature, an aspect of us trying to somehow or another communicate our feelings to another person, I think we can therefore understand that the dilemma or the trauma or the fascination with human sexuality, or indeed sexuality writ large in the hands of Cronenberg's filmography, is the idea of the ironic dilemmas that are always associated with the ability or inability to express oneself and how one feels and how one thinks, and how to understand the other. This is a very, I think, key critical concept of existentialism. And the thinking behind human existence. After all, how is it can we capture a sense of, say, sympathy towards the other when it is almost impossible to perceive the world outside of our own senses or perceptions? This is a very key concept. It's a very key dilemma, how to understand the other. And perhaps one of the ways to do that is through some kind of shared experience that is sexual. After all, there is, I think, something very fundamental and essential in terms of human connectivity and human connections that is through the sexual relationship. And so I think that type of maybe calibration or recognition of the essential fundamental nature and the essential changing and evolutionary nature of sexuality, and how that is evolutionary not just in terms of human evolution and biological terms, but also emotional and spiritual terms, but also socio-political and economic terms, and also in the way that is inherently fundamentally contradictory. I think creates this type of centerpiece, if you will, of maybe a type of endless, a wonderfully, beautifully endless possibility of discussion and consideration and debate with regard to this and other films in the great canon filmography of David Cronenberg. And that's one of the reasons, that's probably one of the strongest reasons for me why a film like Shivers is so fascinating and so important. It leads to these maybe endless possibilities, and it really shows me that this is a horror film, and I'm meant to be shocked by certain genre expectations of the horror film. This is very much a type of that type of a shock-filled and gory, violent work, that's for sure. But it's also work that is very subversive in the way in which it's presenting themes of sexuality and human connection, and indeed existence and evolution and politics, in a way that makes one question and makes me question every time I see it just exactly who are the heroes and who are the villains. And the fact that I'm making those questions, I think, is itself the answer. Namely, there are no heroes or there are no villains. Everything is very gray. And if everything is gray, then that leads to the possibility of an almost endless line of interpretation. That's one of the great exciting things about this film for me. This is quite a film indeed, and I have no capacity to be able to fully comprehend this film. I know that there are so many secrets of this film that I will never be able to penetrate because of my own shallow inabilities. But I do want to emphasize that I have seen this film so many times, and every time I see it, I feel like I am changed in that interesting way. And it's almost like when one watches a Cronenberg film, one is experiencing the type of evolutionary, transformative act that its characters seem to be undergoing within the context of the particular plot dynamics. But my point here is that it always leads to something, and I want to go back to that idea of body horror. That phrase "body horror" is a phrase that I think is associated a lot in terms of how Cronenberg's works are described. Not necessarily how maybe the filmmaker describes his own works per se, but how his works are described in a critical or review-like context. And in one way, I think I'd like to agree with the use of the phrase "body horror," but I think for me, another way to think about body horror, or another way to describe body horror, is the idea of evolution and change. In Cronenberg's films, there's always this idea of evolution and change, and how that change can be horrifying and also can be beautiful and can also lead to new mysteries and new possibilities, and also indeed new challenges and new inabilities. And that is oftentimes linked to this idea of how we connect with other people. And oftentimes this idea or notion of the concept of the way in which human beings connect with each other. Another way to say that is sexuality. Thus, the idea of existence is ultimately linked in the hands of Cronenberg with the concept of sexuality. And that is indeed, I would say, at the very heart and soul of this brilliant horror film from 1975. This is the work which is Shivers. So there is so much more that I think can be said, and much more than I'm capable of saying. I am not an expert when it comes to this film. I have seen it many, many times, but as I've said before, I admit that my understanding is still very, 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 very shallow. I have so much to learn from this. I think one of the great places to go for me in terms of getting more information and more insightful comments from greater experts than I, is, for example, this particular Blu-ray. I do want to mention the Vestron Video Collectors Series films. It's a very interesting, fascinating, eclectic collection of films, included in which is this film Shivers. And so I can strongly recommend this particular Region A, yes, Blu-ray, which has a number of special features on it, included in which are a couple commentary tracks as well. The commentary track in particular with David Cronenberg is very fascinating, and there are a number of other supplements that go towards the history of this film, the importance of this film in the context of Canadian cinema, the way in which you have details about how this film was received, how it was produced and how it was received, also the story of David Cronenberg and how he ended up being a very central part during this stage of Canadian cinema, culture, and history, and also Robert Fulford, Marshall Delaney, Saturday Night, how that had to do with the infamy and the marketing of this film Shivers, leading to, I think, a very fulfilling and quite a fascinating career of David Cronenberg in the films to come. The next feature film being, of course, Rabid, and we will talk about that film in a separate video discussion. But I do want to just say that for anyone who is interested, this Blu-ray is a great place to go in terms of the commentary track, the Cronenberg commentary track. There's a Carmody commentary track too, which is utterly fascinating as well as a number of interviews, Cronenberg interviews, Lynn Lowry interview, etc., and also many other great supplements here. So this is a great place to go. It's certainly a release that I rely on in terms of my rewatch of this utterly fascinating and very profound and shocking work from Cronenberg. And that is Shivers. So anyway, my friends, I do want to end it there. I just want to suggest that, again, there are many places to go for further explorations of this film, and this Blu-ray, I think, is a great jumping off point for that, in case you're interested. But otherwise, my dear friends, what do you think of this film Shivers? I mean, it's a film that I think engenders many discussions, endless discussions, I think rightfully so and deservedly so. And I think it creates a number of different impressions, moods, and opinions from those who see it, Cronenberg fans and otherwise. And so what do you think of this film? Do you like it? Do you not like it? What are your reasons? What is your experience and history with this film, etc.? I would love to hear what it is you have to say about this film. And so please feel free to let me know in the comments section below. And let us hopefully have further discussions about it. But in the meantime, my friends, I hope this video finds you well, and we will continue the discussion with the next film in the filmography, that is the film Rabid. So if you're interested, I look forward to seeing you at the next one. But in the meantime, my dear friends, I very, very much hope that this video finds you well, and until we meet again, please be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of great, great movies. Thank you so much, as always, for your time. I very, very much appreciate it. Stay strong, stay safe, and cheers.